All right, everybody, we are here at long last. Dr. Gaven Kerr is back on the podcast here at Philosophy for the People. And Gavin, I always think it's been too long between conversations for us, and that's because it has been. It really has been a while since you've been on the podcast. Obviously, we keep up very frequently. But dang, yeah, it's probably been at least a couple of months. So give us some update before we talk about the fourth way, which is what we're going to do. The elusive, mysterious fourth way, Aquinas' fourth way, argument for the existence of God. That's the theme today. Let's just do a little catch up for the audience. What have you been up to? What have you been working on? And give us life updates if you don't mind.
So it has been a few months. So it's been a good bit doing. Let me see. So let's see. Well, my new book, collected articles on the existence of God. To anybody who sees me online, I think I got like 150 likes from a Facebook post on that. That's coming out. So Ediciones Scholasticae are publishing that, and I was just on to the publisher yesterday. So my free copies are coming in about 2 weeks. It's going to be on the UK market in about 4 weeks.
Oh wow, awesome! So that's coming. That's coming fast. Yeah.
Yeah, and we went with a paperback version, so it's around £25 sterling, about €30, I think, something comparable in US dollars. So it's not as expensive as my first two books, put it that way. Yeah. So these are my collected articles on the existence of God from the last 10 years, plus a couple of new articles that I've written. So really pleased to get that out and behind me. So that's coming. So that's one thing. I'm going to New Orleans in just over a month to speak at the ACPA, and I'm going to speak on survivalism. I'm going to defend survivalism. So I'm going to be, sort of putting forth the metaphysics of post-mortem survival. So doing that, just teaching away and stuff. Back at just at St. Patrick's. We've got a great bunch of students this year, some great postgrad students as well. We've got great projects they're working on, forcing me to up my game, and revisit philosophers and thinkers that I've read, but maybe not specialized in. And that's always the great thing when you get research students and postgrad students, that you have to kind of sharpen up on some of these thinkers that you've engaged with, but haven't really been really focused on. Other than that, over the summer, well, I did my first MMA fight in June. And I'm doing another MMA fight in December 4th. So I'm currently in fight prep mode at the minute. I'm going to be fighting at 74 kilograms this time around. So anybody who, so in the American system, you work with pounds. So just times 74 by 2.2, and that's my weight in pounds. So it's welterweight. I'm going to be fighting that anyway. Last time I fought at 70 kilograms. So 74 is more my sort of natural lean weight. So I'm currently, I'm eating healthy at the minute, and it's awful.
No fun. Yeah.
Yeah. The interesting thing though is when you cut out sugar and sweets from your diet and everything, fruit now just tastes like, candy, it tastes like sweet. So a banana or, grapes or blueberries is actually you're craving this sort of stuff.
That's your dessert, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'm doing that, and I'm training just really intense. I'm training like 6 days a week, doing conditioning, sort of high intensity conditioning, 4 sessions a week of martial arts training, at least 4 sessions of martial arts training, 2 of which are just fight sessions. The other 2 of which are more kind of just technique, and that's at least, and then 3 days a week of heavy weightlifting. So, I mean, I really am. I mean, I did the same for the last one, really I'm just going to, get into it and go for it. So that's what I've got sort of coming up myself. And other than that, my wife's doing really well for herself with the martial arts. She took up judo and kung fu back in April, and she went off and she did a competition and she took home silver. She went over to England and took home silver in her first competition.
Awesome.
Yeah, she's going back to England, to Manchester next week to train with the Olympic judo team, because they put together this sort of potential squad, and she was invited to go back and train with them. A lady who's been doing martial arts since April, not even been doing judo since April, doing martial arts, has been invited over to Manchester to train with these guys, these people.
Pretty sweet. So, yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I'm intensely proud. I'm like,
Mhm.
the proudest husband, you can meet. So, and the happiest as well now that my wife and I get to, fight and roll
You
with
got
each
just
other and stuff.
another yeah, another thing that you guys have together. That's so cool. That's so cool.
Yeah,
Man, I'm always so
because we
impressed
don't.
by what you're
Yeah.
doing, Gavin. Not just the academic work, but obviously you've got a beautiful family, and they have
Mm,
taken family is always a huge priority. Then the fitness, the martial arts. How much
mm.
caffeine do you drink? That's because
Um,
so it's got to be a lot, right?
I just saw Neve Palmer put a question in there. She wants a free copy of the book. Don't worry, Neve, you'll be getting a free copy. Neve Palmer can tell you how much coffee I drink because she's the only
Mhm.
person who's ever gone toe to toe with me coffee drinking.
Mhm.
I would drink about 8 Americanos a day.
Oh, dude,
Five
I
before
would have a seizure, man. I couldn't come anywhere close to that. Yeah.
5 before lunchtime. And then I would have maybe 2 or 3 cans of Monster a day on top of the Americanos.
Holy cow. Holy cow. That's yeah, that's a whole new level. I'm like, I have 2 cups of
Yeah,
coffee. I'm
really?
not sleeping. I'm not even sleeping that night. I'm like a 1 cup of coffee, then maybe a cup of tea after that kind of guy. I'm quite sensitive to caffeine, but that's impressive, my friend. It's impressive across the board. So always great. Always great to get those updates. So we'll have to have you on again, obviously before the fight, but we'll make
Mm,
sure we keep up with that as well. So
mm.
Gavin, the fourth way is on the table today, and obviously
Yeah.
we've talked a lot about Aquinas and his metaphysics and his various and really his way to God. In fact,
Yeah.
I should mention it now. Gavin and I have a book submitted together
Mhm.
with Catholic Answers. People have been asking, when is this book coming out? It's on De Ante and the Five Ways. The answer is I don't know. We gave them the manuscript. I think it was back in spring, and we're still waiting. So
Mm,
when we know something, we'll let you guys know. And
mm,
yeah, the fourth way is in there, obviously, and
mm.
so if you like what you hear in this episode, you'll probably dig that book when it comes out. But I'm going to let you take the
Sure.
reins on this conversation, Gavin. The fourth way
Mhm.
is, of course, it's one of those things, and I was in this camp too. When I first read it, I didn't know what to think of it. And
Mhm.
I didn't think it was bad. I didn't think it was good. I just didn't know what to think of it. Right?
Sure. Yeah.
That isn't everyone's impressions. A lot of people, they see it and they're like, "This is clearly a horrible, ridiculous argument." And then
Mm,
there's a
mm,
camp of people like you. Um,
mhm,
and maybe this is just a contrarian in you, Gavin, where when people on Twitter ask, "What's your favorite argument for the existence of God from Aquinas?"
mhm.
There's just this contingent of people that say the fourth way. It's a small
Yeah.
contingent,
Yeah.
but you're among that
Yeah.
contingent. I think it was Ed Fazer
Yeah.
or somebody on
Yeah.
Twitter. You
Yeah.
answered it the way, the fourth way. So before we get into it, why is it the fourth way? And start to introduce us to this elusive argument. Is it as bad as everybody thinks, or is there more going for this argument than maybe people get at first impression? Mhm.
Yeah, I think you are just right about me, that contrarian nature about me, that I do. Maybe it's just the Irish in me, or maybe it's just me. Um, but I do kind of go against the grain with a lot of things. Everybody reads Thomas as an Aristotelian. Well, you know what? I'm going to read him as a Platonist. Within the Platonic camp, everybody favors, Fabro over Geiger. Well, maybe I'm going to sit with Geiger rather than Fabro, that sort of thing. I don't know. I just, tend to be. I tend. I tend to focus more on the contrarian or minority positions, because when I look at important thinkers and important commentators who adopt these minority positions, I think, well, what is it about that has attracted somebody to that? Is there anything in it that could attract a thinker that I hugely respect? Now that's not why I like the fourth way, but I do generally have that attitude within philosophy. I am attracted to these minority positions just to see if I can make something out of them. Um, Now, one of the reasons why I was attracted to the fourth way was principally because I was never really interested in any of the five ways, to be honest.
Yeah.
They never really did anything for me. Obviously, the argument from De Ante, really resonated with me. because as we've discussed, he just sets up the metaphysics beautifully, and he just sets out the argument. And so you have the argument coming as a stage in him setting up his metaphysics, his vision for reality. And that just set really well with me as a metaphysician, that we're not just trying to give independent arguments for God's existence. We're doing metaphysics, and oh look, here is a proof of God's existence. Right. Let's move on and keep doing metaphysics. So I really like that. And so the deity argument I liked. The arguments for God in De Potentia, question 3, where he's talking about creation, says we can have a proof of a creator, and here's 3 different arguments, all of them more or less the same argument, riffing off again the deity argument, or the common framework of the deity argument. And it was this common framework of the deity argument and the De Potentia argument and a few other arguments that, having sort of mastered that and gained the insight into that, when I went back to have a look at the 5 ways, and I came upon the 4th way, I thought, oh wow, the other 5 ways, they have this common framework, but the 4th way just really has it explicitly, fundamentally. It's just there on the surface of the 4th way, whereas the other ways, it has it, but you kind of have to show how it has it. So that's why when I went back to the 4th ways, I thought, well, wow, this is quite interesting. And I was reading articles by Van Steenbergen and by Fabro at the time, who had written on the 4th way and who had traced back Aquinas' thinking on the 4th way to his engagement with Neoplatonism, to his engagement with Proclus, Liber de Causis, the Pseudo-Dionysius and others, and argued that the 4th way comes from Aquinas' Neoplatonic metaphysics. Again, that really resonated with me, because when I first engaged with Thomas's metaphysics, as I say, a lot of people read Thomas as an Aristotelian, at least in the Thomistic revival in the early 20th century. Fabro and Geiger and an Irishman called Arthur Little come along, and they point out that Thomas's metaphysics, in its most characteristic and unique aspects, is not Aristotelian at all, but it's Neoplatonic, the metaphysics of participation and of essence and existence, that this is Neoplatonism. Thomas is consciously Neoplatonic, and he reads his Aristotle in a Neoplatonic fashion. So when I came to Thomas's metaphysics, that really resonated with me. So with this Neoplatonic participation framework in mind, when I come to read the 4th way as embedded within that metaphysics and drawn upon it, it just, cried out to me. And so that's why it sort of, was full of interest for me. Right. So there you go.
No, if I can just offer a quick comment, this was a big shift for me too, especially when I started reading your work in Whipple. Because when I really started, studying Aquinas, I fell into the more Aristotelian camp, right? Not by my own will; those were just the types of interpreters I was studying. So even when I would see an iteration of the 4th way that I thought wasn't the worst argument, and maybe it was plausible, it always seemed disjointed from the other ones. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Why, right? Okay, even if this works, it just seems so out of place, right? It's just there's not a harmony there. But when you come to, once you make the existentialist turn, my little tenders, and you understand this sort of Neoplatonic backdrop, not only does the 4th way become far more interesting, I think far stronger as an argument, you can then actually begin, as we try to argue in our book and you argue in your work, unify the 5 ways systematically. And then it becomes really cool and beautiful. Do you want to? Maybe you just want to say a little bit about that in general, especially for people who we're kind of this is insider baseball a little bit here, but I think this is important and interesting stuff, right?
Yeah, sure. So I think the main principle behind Thomas's Neoplatonic metaphysics, it all goes back to Plato's theory of forms. It's everything Platonism does. And if the listeners they're aware, I'm sure that probably most of them are, of Plato's myth of the cave, the parable of the cave, that the people are in the cave, they're seeing the shadows on the wall projected on the wall, but these shadows are always shadows of something, and they're of objects from the outside world. So when the prisoner escapes the cave and sees the objects are what are really real, and the shadows are just a participation of those objects. Were there not objects for them to be shadows of, they would not be shadows. There would be no shadows. So the reality of the shadows is a participated or a derived reality in the reality of the objects. And that's just pure Platonism. So Thomas has that in his metaphysics. Obviously, he doesn't get it from Plato because he's not reading Plato, but he gets it from the Neoplatonists. And in Thomas's hands, that's articulated in the principle that the per aliud, what is through another, is reducible to what is in itself. Okay, so the per aliud, what is through another, is reducible to what is per se or in itself. Sometimes Thomas uses the language of what is per participationem, what is through participation is reducible to that which is per se unparticipated. And so when you think back to the Platonic example, the myth of the cave, the shadows are through another. They have their form through another, i.e. the object of which they are shadows, but the object does not have its form, let's say, through anything else. It just is the form that the shadows have. So it is per se the form that the shadows have, and the shadows are dependent upon it, but it is not dependent on the shadows. So the insight behind that is that reality is a participated reality. It doesn't have actuality per se. Okay, so it doesn't have actuality in and of itself. Essentially, it has it through another. And so what is the other through which reality has its actuality? Well, that's reducible to some per se other that has actuality through itself and not through another. And I mean, I'm sure the listeners are aware that's that's embedded within Aquinas' thinking on essentially ordered series, the metaphysics of essentially ordered series. That in such series, the members of such causal series don't have the causal actuality of the series per se in themselves. They have it through another, so they just participate in that causal actuality, such that were there not a cause for that causal actuality, there would be no cause in question, or no causality in question. Now, the cause of that causal actuality can't be per aliud, it can't be through another with respect to that causal actuality, because then it would just be one of the things participating in that causal actuality and not the source and origin of the causal actuality itself. So the cause of that causal actuality must be per se. It must have the causal actuality in itself, in whose causality the members of the causal series participate. And so we've been through examples. You always give the example of, the moon participates in the light of the sun, and through so participating, it can illuminate, everything in the evening time, when we're out and about in the evening. So the sun illuminates per se in virtue of what it is. The moon really receives the illumination of the sun, and we receive the illumination of the moon. We are participating in that illumination, but ultimately, were there no per se source of that illumination, i.e. the sun, there just would be no illumination, full stop. And then there's other examples, such as the mind moving the hand to move the stick to move the stone, or the fire heating the pot to heat the contents. And all of that articulates Thomas's commitment to the principle that what is through another is reducible to what is per se. And that's Platonism. That is pure and utter Platonism.
Yeah. And go ahead. Finish your thought. Yep.
Just to point out, and we can get on to it, but if you want to bring anything up, that is the common line of argument in each one of the 5 ways. Every one of the 5 ways deploys that principle that what is through another is reducible to what is per se. Each of the 5 ways takes some actuality, which things have through another, and then traces that to a per se source of that actuality. And once we have a per se source of actuality, we have something which is a per se source of actuality. So it's per se actual, which is God. Each of the 5 ways deploy that argumentation. The 4th way in particular.
Yeah. Okay. That was fantastic stage setting. So if that didn't make like if you're new to this conversation, stick with us, because you're going to see a lot of that in application here once we get into the argument. But that's so important, right? Because if you don't do the sort of metaphysical windup, you're just not going to get Aquinas' arguments. You're just not. And that's the usual disclaimer we have to always give, that if you just pull the New Atheist and you go and you just read his 5 ways in isolation, you're probably just going to write them off as being unserious, right? But at that point, really, you've been unserious, because they were meant to be summaries, first off, right? and they're meant to be, of course, be read or understood in light of Aquinas's greater metaphysical system. So, as tedious as this sometimes is, it really is necessary if you want to appreciate, understand what Aquinas is up to with the 5 ways that you do see his wider metaphysical system as a whole, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. I mean, any philosopher, if you're going to read any philosopher, you need to understand that philosopher's metaphysics. Every philosopher is deploying a metaphysics, even when they protest that they are not. Every philosopher is deploying some kind of metaphysics, and the philosophers who protest that they're not deploying a metaphysics, Carnap, for example, they're actually harder to come to terms with because they don't make any sense unless you can decipher the latent metaphysics that they protest are not committed to, but which will only make their positions make sense. So you can't understand any philosophy unless you understand the metaphysics to which the philosopher is committed. Thomas, at least, he's explicit about what that metaphysics is. So if you want to seriously read any philosophy, you have to read metaphysics.
Right. Yeah. And you said something earlier. I just want to reiterate the great thing about Thomas is, and the beautiful thing about the De Ente, is you just rolling up your sleeves, doing philosophy of nature, doing metaphysics. And oh, by the way, this entails the existence of God. It's not just like somebody's just like doing the old apologetics thing, but hey, we're just fine. I actually don't have an issue with apologetics. I'm just trying to come up with any old arguments for the existence of God. That's just not, it's really not what Aquinas was up to, right? Really just trying to carve reality at its joints, make sense of common experience, illuminate, set it in relation to the whole, and just out of that system is the classical theistic paradigm. I always found that, I still do find that the most compelling system and the most compelling reasons to actually believe in God. But it is a very different sort of thing than so much of even modern philosophy, religion, or modern apologetics, isn't it?
Yeah. I agree. There's a tendency in modern philosophy to avoid systematization, except maybe in the German idealists. But there is this general tendency to avoid systematization. We deal with individual problems. We don't develop a framework within which individual problems find their place and their solutions. We just deal with a problem one by one. Now, I think I have a diagnosis of that, and the diagnosis is medieval nominalism leading to Cartesianism and separation of mind and world, and that's a different story. I think that's a hangover from modernity that we're still trying to recover from. We still haven't recovered from that hangover,
right?
So I mean, nominalism is a pretty bad session to give that sort of centuries old hangover. We need to get into a pre-nominalistic worldview. And incidentally, that's why I really value and appreciate the German idealists, Kant and Hegel in particular, because I don't think they were idealists at all. I think they were more sort of critical realists or moderate realists, the kind of Aquinas and Aristotle were.
Right on. Yeah, always great reminders. Hey, by the way, gentle listeners, we'll try and do some Q&A towards the end. I see lots of good discussion going on already. So if you have any questions, you're welcome to submit them. We'll try to get to some of those towards the end. But Gavin, if you're ready, why don't we dive into the fourth way? Again,
absolutely.
Start us however you want. Yep, go for it.
Yeah. So everybody, just bear in mind that way of thinking from Thomas, that the parallel is reducible to the per se. He's going to latch on to features, to actualities that things have through another, and trace it back to what has those features per se. So when we look at the fourth way, the fourth way split into 2 parts. There is what I call the maxime stage. And the maxime stage is where Thomas takes what's called the approximating relation. So he begins the fourth way by talking about these gradations that are found in things, and these gradations approximate to something which has the gradated reality. Most are maximally. So I call this the maxime stage. And then having established that you have something which is maximal, Thomas then argues that, what is maximal in being is the cause for being for all else. And that's the second stage of the argument. And that's just a general sort of split in the argument, the 2-stage approach. We'll go through the details of that. The most important is going to be the maxime stage, where Thomas goes from gradations with regard to certain properties or characteristics to something that is maximal with respect to those characteristics. So that's probably going to be our main focus, because
I agree. That's certainly the most controversial part of the argument. Yeah.
Yeah. So listen, I'll just read it, and then we can just pick it apart. Does that sound cool?
Sounds great to me, Gavin. Yep.
Okay. So this is my translation of the fourth way, but it doesn't really diverge that much from other translations. So it goes as follows. The fourth way is taken from the gradations that are found in things. Accordingly, there is found in things something more or less good and true and noble and such like. But more and less are said of diverse things according as they diversely approach what is so maximally. Just as the hotter is that which approaches what is maximally hot. There is something then that is most true and best and most noble and consequently maximally in being. For what are maximally true are maximally beings, as I said in the second book of the Metaphysics. Okay, so that's the first stage. So that's I call that the maximi stage or the maximal stage. So I'll just take you through Thomas's reasoning there, and I'll just explain how I interpret this. So the first thing that Thomas observes are gradations that are found in things. Things are more and less. Things have more and less of certain properties. And Thomas says, well, look at these properties. Things are more or less good, true, and noble, and such like. Now let's just, pause ourselves there. The good, the true, and the noble. So Thomas says things have more or less goodness, more or less truth, more or less nobility to them. And immediately the first thing that anybody who has a bit of an understanding of Aquinas might, or medieval philosophy in general, might think about, well, I've seen the good and the true mentioned before, in context with each other as features of things. Where have I seen that before? His discussion of the transcendentals.
Right.
Yeah. So the transcendentals, the typical list is the unity, truth, and goodness. So that's the typical list of the transcendentals: unity, truth, and goodness. If anybody would like to read up on the transcendentals and Aquinas' thought, a new edition of the Cambridge Companion to Aquinas has been brought out, where someone has written a chapter in it on the transcendentals. So,
I thought I had it right here. I was going to advertise it for you, but I must have brought it downstairs. But it's very good, so people should pick it up, right?
Yeah, somebody that the gentle listeners might be familiar with has written the chapter on the transcendentals in that. So, unity, truth, and goodness, they're the typical transcendentals. So when we read that first bit of the fourth way, Thomas is saying things have more or less unity, truth, and nobility. We were thinking, he's talking about the transcendentals here. What are the transcendentals? They are features of being, which are found everywhere the being is found, and they refer directly to the things being. So they're interchangeable with the being of things. A being, in virtue of being, is one, true, and good. So people think, some interpreters thought that, what Thomas is getting at here are the transcendental perfections of being, such that if we can show that, things have these transcendental perfections, then in having them, they participate in being in some way, and we trace that back to something which is maximal in being. The only problem here, now that's a nice, neat way of interpreting that. The only problem here is Thomas uses the example of nobility.
Yeah, what is this nobility? Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So unity and truth, it is found in every list of the transcendentals. Do you know what isn't found in every list of the transcendentals? Well, beauty.
Nobility.
Beauty isn't. So beauty isn't found in any of the lists of the transcendentals. I hate to break that to the gentle listeners, that beauty isn't found in any of the lists, but nobility isn't found in any of the lists. And so what are we to make of that? So some of those who push that, it's the transcendentals that Thomas is concerned with suggest, look, this is maybe another transcendental perfection that Thomas is suggesting. It's just another transcendental, which is convertible with being. And there's some plausibility to that, because what Thomas goes on to reason is that what is maximal with regard to goodness and truth is maximal with regard to being. And that's, if it's the transcendentals, yeah, that makes sense, because unity and goodness and truth are convertible with being. What's maximal in that regard will be maximal with regard to being. But if nobility isn't a transcendental, then what's maximal in nobility will not be maximal in being. And so it's hard to see how Thomas can get to that conclusion that we have something maximal in being. So we kind of need nobility to be a transcendental. So we're on a bit of an interpretive tightrope here. If unity isn't a transcendental, we can't get to something maximal in being, so the argument goes. But at the same time, this is the only place where it would seem Thomas is suggesting that nobility is a transcendental perfection. what are we to do to this with this? Well, what I did whenever I wrote my article on the fourth way, I took the term nobilitas and I went to the Index Thomisticus. So if any of the gentle listeners don't know, the Index Thomisticus, it's freely available online. You can search any term in Aquinas' Opera Omnia that you want, just to see every context in which it comes up. You can refine your terms. You can refine the works it referred to. You can do that. So I took the term nobilitas, right? And I searched the Index Thomisticus, and I went through nearly every instance that Thomas used the term nobilitas. Mm-hmm. Not one, unless I missed it, not one of them suggests that it was a transcendental. Mm-hmm. Okay? But you know what most of them, when it was talking about nobility as a feature of beings, you know what most of them suggested whenever Thomas used the term nobilitas? He was talking about perfection. He was talking about a thing's perfection. Mm-hmm. Nobilitas and perfection were used interchangeably for Thomas,
right,
on so many occasions, and I mentioned in the article, just type in nobilitas into the Index Thomisticus and you'll just see so many occasions where he uses nobilitas and perfection interchangeably. Mm-hmm. And what does Thomas mean by perfection? He means something which is complete, something which is actual, something which is not in potency, but something which is in actuality. So nobilitas in Thomas's mind signifies or pertains to actuality. A thing has nobility to the degree that it has actuality. And this was, whenever I did this, I was treating of the fourth way, and whenever I discovered this, that a thing has nobility to the degree that it has actuality, I nearly fell out of my chair. Because now we have actuality. Now we have things having degrees more or less actuality. Yeah. And I'm thinking, well, this I can get a handle on in Aquinas' thought. Once you can get a handle on things having degrees of actuality, you're into participated actuality, things having actuality to the degree that they can have it, not more or less than the degree to which they can have it. So not only did that help me resolve the nobilitas issue, that we're not dealing with transcendental perfections here, we're dealing with some kind of actuality that a thing has. It allowed me to deal with that, but it also allowed me to get a handle on the fourth way and understand what Thomas means by the more and the less, which we're going to get to. But that was my interpretive key to getting a handle on the more or the less. So when Thomas talks here about the more or less with regard to unity, truth, and nobility, the good, the true, and the noble, he's talking about things having certain degrees of actuality. And how is it that things have certain degrees of actuality? Well, they don't have the actuality that they possess per se. Okay, they don't have it per se. They don't have it essentially. If they had actuality essentially, they would just be pure actuality. They would have it per se. They wouldn't stand in potency to the actuality that they have. If they stand in potency to the actuality that they have it through another, and they are actualized. So things which have degrees of actuality, the more or less of goodness, truth, and nobility, don't have actuality per se. They have it per aluit. Okay, they have it per participationem. Okay, now, you imagine me coming to this with this, what I explained at the beginning, that the per aluit is reduced to the per se. So I've got this in mind, and then all of a sudden, I see here that Thomas is thinking of actuality when he's thinking of truth, goodness, and nobility. And so all of a sudden, Thomas is thinking of things which, have a participated actuality. And then he's reasoning to something which is per se with respect to that actuality. Well, we've already seen him in the first, second, and third way provide the argumentation for how you get from the per aluit to the per se in terms of essentially ordered series. So he's deploying exactly the same causal reasoning in the fourth way that he did in the first, second, and third ways.
Right. So it's not some radically different thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. The first way, the actuality in question is motion. Okay, the hand moves the stick that moves the stone. Each of them have motion, but they don't have motion per se. They have a per aluit, and so they depend on something which can originate that motion. The mental agent, it has the motion per se. And so we have a primary cause of essentially ordered series. Same for the second way, same for the third way. Well, here in the fourth way, we have things which have actuality per aluit, and just like the motion in the first way, causality in the second way, and so on, were there not a per se source of that, the things wouldn't have the participated actuality in question. So when we have that, the maximi stage, when Thomas says, so we've got there is found in things something more or less good, true, and noble, i.e., more or less actuality in such things. Thomas goes on to say, but the more and the less are said of diverse things, according as they diversely approach what is so maximally, just as the hotter is that which approaches what is maximally hot. In other words, things which have actuality per aliud and not per se point towards something which has actuality per se or maximally. Unless there is something that is most true and best and most noble and consequently maximally in being, these things would not have the diverse degrees or participations of goodness, truth, and nobility. So there must be something which is maximal with respect to actuality, without which things which are more or less or per aliud with regard to actuality derive the actuality that they have. And just one point on that, the example Thomas uses, just as the hotter is that which approaches what is maximally hot. Think about that. What is maximally hot? If we're just thinking degrees of temperature, I mean, what is the maximal with regard to that? It's conceivable that you could just go on and on and on and on and on with maximal hotness. Obviously, I mean, Thomas knew that. Obviously, you can't. Obviously, that's not what Thomas means, that there's some quantitative addition to what's maximally hot. So what could he mean by talking about what is maximally hot? What I argue in the article is that what is maximally hot is per se hot. What heats in and of itself, what is not dependent on others for its heat, but which heats and on which others are dependent. That is
the critical interpretive shift. If you don't make that shift, you're not only going to, I think, not understand the argument, certainly not according to the way you think it should be understood, but then you're going to open it up to a host of objections, right? That could be taken as more or less threatening, right? Like why couldn't we just have continuing degrees of hot things, right? And thinking of it in this quantitative sense, but that's, as you're arguing, that's not what Aquinas had in mind. He had in mind what he had in mind was this notion of derivation and participation and through another, through itself, per se, all that, right? So I don't know if you want to just reemphasize that more, because like for you, this was a big shift for me, where I went from, I don't know, kind of like being flirtatious with the fourth way, like maybe there's a way you could kind of make this work, to realizing, no, if you look at it this way, I actually think this is quite good, right? In relation to Aquinas' other metaphysical commitments, for sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, the key interpretive factor here is that something is more or less with respect to actuality insofar as it doesn't have the actuality per se. It has it through another. So it only participates in actuality. Think of the actuality of illumination by the sun. There are some things which participate in the illumination of the sun in different degrees, depending on how close or far away they are to the sun. So Mercury, enjoys the heat and the illumination of the sun to a much greater degree than, Earth and, people on the Earth. So and depending on the position of the Earth in relation to the sun, the time of the year and so forth, we'll get more or less illumination, more or less heat from the sun, so on and so forth, because we simply participate in it. We possess the participated actuality in question to the degree that we can. And just as a wee side note here, Thomas makes exactly the same point when it comes to his metaphysics of essence and existence, that things that exist, their acts of existence are individuated by the essences whose acts of existence they are. So things have the actuality of existence. They have esse to the limited degree of the essence that the esse actuates. So my essence is actuated by my esse, no more, no less. Your essence is actuated by your esse, no more, no less. It's the same principle being deployed here. Unreceived act or unreceived actuality is unlimited. So the received act is limited back to the mode of the receiver. We have things here which have the actuality of goodness, truth, and nobility. In other words, they just, have some limited actuality, and they limit it by receiving it to the degree that they can receive that actuality, which is all to say they are dependent on an other for that actuality. That's the approximating relationship they approximate or they point to or are causally derived from that other, which is per se with respect to that actuality. And that's the whole point of the heat and the fire example. Something maximal in heat is not something which has, heat to the nth degree. It's something which has heat per se, i.e. which heats in virtue of what it is and cannot feel the heat. The only way it could feel the heat would be for it to feel to be what it is. Whereas things enjoy its heat and are dependent on its heat and are more or less hot, depending on how they approximate to it, because they don't have its heat per se. They have it through another, i.e. through the fire or through whatever is the source of heat. So that's how we understand the Maxime stage here. Now, there's just one last point we need to make about the Maxime stage, but that's how we understand Thomas's reasoning here in the Maxime stage. He's reasoning from what is through another with regard to actuality, the true, the good, and the noble, to what is per se with regard to the actuality. Now, there's one final point we need to make about that, that gets us to something maximally in being or some maximal being, but that's the interpretive key to the first part of the argument.
Yeah, that's excellent. So I really don't have much to add to that. That's super clarifying, and I just wanted you to, I guess, emphasize it as much as possible, so that way you can avoid, I don't know, the various parody attempts. What was Dawkins again? The maximal stinker or something like that?
Oh yeah, the smelliest. Yeah, exactly.
Right. But actually, it makes sense. Like, if something isn't smelly inherently, it's got to come from somewhere, right?
it's through another. Yeah,
right.
That's if odor is an actuality that a thing has. Yeah, but yeah, that was just Dawkins' parody of the whole thing. But I would just maybe emphasize to the gentle listeners that perhaps Dawkins is not the best commentator to be reading on Aquinas's metaphysical thought, or any metaphysical thought, or any philosophical thought in general.
Just a little tip there. Okay, so if something is sort of, and it's important to understand in Aquinas' metaphysics, he is committed to degrees and modes of being, right? I think that's just part of the package. I mean, of course, right? Substance, accident, these are modes of being. Our existence is something like to be our being caused, right? Whereas God's existence just is his aseity, right? So there's clearly modes of being in Aquinas, and it's true. So, to the extent that something is an act potency composite, does not have existence inherently. So it's already setting up for this sort of derivative causal series that is necessarily terminating in something that just possesses that actuality inherently, just is pure actuality. I mean, this is very close to de ente once you give it this interpretive understanding. Of course it is. It's like a privilege. It's just like a privileged path right into de ente, right?
Yeah. I mean, the de ente just deploys the same reasoning. All the Aquinas' arguments, all of them, I've been through all of them. They all deploy the same reasoning.
Right. Man's consistent, right?
I mean, it's just this vision that he has. And again, it's the metaphysics. It's this metaphysical vision that he has, Neoplatonic in character, of things that are through another, ultimately reduced back to a source, which is per se. And you want to trace that back in the history of philosophy. That's Plato. That's the form of the good, the divided line culminating in the form of the good. Obviously, Thomas didn't have that, but that's the origin of all of that. So the final bit of the Maxime stage is where Thomas reasons that there's something that's most true, best, and most noble, i.e. maximal with respect to these features. And Thomas says, consequently, maximal in being. Maxime ends. For what are maximally true are maximally beings, as is said in the second book of the Metaphysics. So that's Aristotle, book 2 of the Metaphysics. He argues for the convertibility of the true and being. So what do we make of this? How do we get from maximal with respect to truth, goodness, and nobility to maximal in being? Well, the way I interpret it in the article, and the way I've sort of been setting it up here, if what Thomas has in mind here is actuality, so if goodness, truth, and nobility really just signify actuality, whatever is maximal with respect to goodness, truth, and nobility is maximal with respect to actuality. But what is actuality? What's the principle of actuality? For Thomas, it's esse. That's what actuality is. Nothing is actual without esse, because esse makes something to be something rather than nothing. I would also point out that Thomas takes nobility, nobilitas, and perfection to be convertible. Esse is also the perfection of all perfections. So I argue that plausibly when Thomas talks about nobility, he has esse in mind. And indeed, the fourth way is the only one of the 5 ways which mentions esse explicitly. So SA is mentioned in the second stage of the argument. I argue here that because these perfections signify actuality, and actuality for Thomas is SA, whatever is maximal or per se with regard to actuality is per se SA, and so maximally in being, or a maximal being. Because what is per se SA? Is
just unbounded.
That's God, obviously.
Right. Yeah.
Obviously. I mean, anything other than it is subject to it. There's nothing, to which it is subject. Well, that just follows from its being per se actual. There's nothing, independent of it to which it is subject. Everything other than it is subject to it. So it's maximal in being. And so that's how you get to, that which is maximal in all these respects being maximal in being. And that's the first stage of the fourth way. That's the most important stage. That's the one where you have to do all the work to get there. The rest just falls into place after that.
Yeah, excellent. Well, help it fall into place, if you don't mind, Gavin. Why don't we tie it all together here, and then we can take some questions from the audience, if that's cool with you. Yep.
Yeah, no problem. So the second stage is where he says, now, what is maximally such in a given genus is the cause of all members of that genus. As fire, which is maximally hot, there's the fire example, being fire is maximally hot. And maybe I'll just point out, I'm going to get on a sidetrack here. Fire is maximally hot, but fire, what's the highest degree that fire could get to? It's not, it's not so many thousand degree Kelvin or whatever. He's saying fire is maximally hot here. He's talking about any fire. So what he means is that fire is per se hot. Fire heats of itself. That's what he means by maximal. So just to point that out there. But so back to the second stage. What is maximally such in a given genus is the cause of all members of that genus. As fire, which is maximally hot, is the cause of all hot things. Therefore, there is something which is the cause of SA. There's SA come in. There's something that is the cause of SA for all beings and of goodness and every other perfection. And this we call God. That's the second stage. So the first stage, he shows that we have something which is maximal, a maximal being. And the second stage, he shows that that is the cause of SA and thus of all else. So really the reason why there's an interesting hermeneutical issue here, but the way this falls into place is that if we interpret the maximal to mean what is per se, with respect to what we're talking about, Thomas is arguing that what is per se in respect of some sort of given genus, such as heat, is the cause of all derived members of that genus. So you have fire, which is per se hot. It heats in virtue of what it is. So anything which isn't fire, but which, possesses heat, depends, let's say, on the fire for heat. It participates in the fire. It has heat per allude. And what is the allude? What is the other on which it depends? It's the fire which has it per se. So Thomas here in the second part is reasoning that whatever is per se within a given genus with respect to the reality of a given genus is the source of all the members of that genus, i.e. that which possess the reality of the genus, but only do so in a participated way. So this per se source of that reality, of that actuality, is the cause for all the participated members having that reality in a parallel fashion. Now, the interesting hermeneutical point here is that Thomas mentions genus here, but he's talking about being. Okay, so he says, what is maximal in a given genus is the cause of all members of that genus, and he's literally just previously said, we have something maximal in being. So is Thomas suggesting that being is a genus? And that would be a big no-no, because Aristotle, being can't be a genus because a genus is diversified by something extrinsic to it. There's nothing extrinsic to being. So there's nothing extrinsic to being that could diversify it. So being doesn't have the status of a genus and isn't diversified in that way. There aren't any species of being. Being is diversified analogically or proportionately. So I addressed this point in the article, and I actually I don't have it in front of me, but I locate a text in the Metaphysics where Thomas is just talking about a general collection. He's not talking about a logical genus, a genus proper, which is diversified by a differentiating principle into its species. He is just talking about some sort of generic or general collection, and in metaphysics. I quote a text from the metaphysics where Thomas says we can use language in this way. We can use the term genus to speak just of, a common grouping of things, but which isn't a genus proper. So there is legitimate usage within Thomas himself. This isn't just, casting back and fixing something. There is legitimate usage in Thomas himself that we can use that technical, logical language of genus and species in a non-technical manner to just talk about, a grouping of things. And we do that in English as well. We use the term generic or general when we don't mean a logical genus proper. And we can use language that way. So when Thomas is talking here about what is first within a given genus, I interpret him to mean what is per se with regard to a general grouping, and what makes that grouping a grouping is the commonality of the particular actuality that they have, such as goodness, truth, or nobility. But what Thomas was talking about is being. So he's talking about all the beings that there are. Take all them together. What do they have in common? They have being in common, i.e. they have esse in common, but they don't have it per se. They have a per aliud. Therefore, the conclusion of the fourth way, there's something which is the cause of the esse for all beings. That's what they have in common. They have the esse in common. That's what groups them together, but they don't have it per se. They have a per aliud. So what is maximal with regard to being, i.e. is per se actual, is per se esse, is the cause of esse for all beings, and of goodness, which is, just another actuality, and of every other perfection, i.e. every other actuality. So you have some per se cause of esse for any actuality that there is, and this is what we call God. And that's the conclusion of the fourth way.
Beautiful. And obviously there's so much de ente through all of that I will just encourage people, if you have not heard our, at this point, many conversations on Aquinas' de ente, go back and check those out. I actually, a lot of them are on the old channel before I split the podcast into two, the old Pat Flynn channel. Unfortunately, I don't think I have the files anymore. I would re-upload some of them here, so you have to just go back to the old channel to find them. But at some point, Gavin and I we are going to do a study on the de ente. That will come, and we'll go a little bit more depth into that. So awesome. Seems that seems all right and good to me. I don't. Is it my favorite of Aquinas' ways? I don't know. I don't know. I have to sit down and think about that. I still really like the third way, actually, for a lot of different reasons.
Okay.
I don't know. I'll think about it. Let's take some questions from the audience, shall we, Gavin? That cool with you?
Absolutely.
By the way, guys, we got a double header tonight. Once we're finished with Dr. Kerr here, we've got Eric Ybarra coming on to talk about the filioque.
Oh, nice.
So, double header on philosophy for the people tonight. All right. Let's. I'm going to grab this one from Callum, because I believe Callum was one of the gentle listeners who really wanted to see an episode on the fourth way. Am I remembering that right, Callum? If so, has this been to your satisfaction? I hope. Callum's question is this: Gavin, what do you think was Aquinas' personal favorite argument for God? I recently read a paper which claimed that Thomas most frequently appealed to design arguments throughout his surviving corpus. All right, so forget our favorite arguments, Gavin. Let's enter the psychology of St. Thomas himself. What was his favorite argument? What was his beloved pet?
Yeah, so there is there's a paper, God, I think it came out in the 30s, which went through every single one of Aquinas's arguments for God's existence. So when I said that I've read all of them, it's because I got a copy of that paper, and I just went to every single argument for God's existence that there is. Offhand, I can't remember the name of the paper or where to find it. I'm quickly looking through a document of mine, another article that I've thrown together, which includes it. But as yet, my eyes haven't come across it. But with regard to, I remember reading that paper, and the point that seemed to be made in that paper is that when it comes to sort of pedagogical arguments for God's existence, in other words, arguments for God's existence which would convince a listener, Thomas did seem to favor arguments from teleology. I think in the commentary in John's Gospel, he says that, this is the best. This is the best way to argue for God's existence. I just found the paper. It's Reverend Jules A. Besney, St. Thomas Aquinas' proofs for the existence of God presented in their chronological order. So that's the author's surname is Baisne, Baisne, and the second to last E has an acute accent on it, so it's a French name. It's St. Thomas Aquinas' proofs for the existence of God presented in their chronological order. So in those, so I think, as memory serves, Baisne does say that when it comes pedagogically speaking, it is teleological design type arguments, but when it comes to just within a systematic philosophical context, as memory serves, it's the argument for motion. Aquinas' argument for motion, now not Aristotle's argument for motion, Aquinas' own argument for motion, which I and several other authors take to be different from Aristotle's, but it's the argument for motion seems to be the one that he favored, as memory serves.
Cool. Yeah, good.
So yeah, sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, good question, Callum, and we appreciate your support of the show. Good to have you here. And it's a fun question. Here's one from Urang Utan. Is that a brute? Mm-hmm. That is a brute. Urang says, a question for Gavin the Great. Is it worthwhile studying the is it worthwhile studying the supplementum, Gavin, at depth? It's very rarely referred to. Thank you for all the fabulous shows. Well, thank you, Urang.
Yeah, so the supplementum volume of the Summa Theologiae contains discussions of the sacraments that Thomas didn't get to discuss when he stopped writing the third part of the Summa. So there's a discussion of the sacraments. There's a discussion of resurrection, the last things, all that sort of really cool stuff. And it's sort of pieced together from his commentary on the sentences. Now, one could argue, well, you could just turn to the Contra Gentiles, book 4, and you could get that same stuff. But here's the thing. And this is actually something that, I kind of bring up when in my article on the argument for motion from the Contra Gentiles, which is actually included in the Collected Articles book coming out, is that in the Contra Gentiles, Thomas has what I think to be an apologetical sort of context in mind. He's thinking as a preacher, and I refer to Jean-Pierre Torel, who holds that whilst the Dominicans in southern Spain preaching to the Muslims context of the Contra Gentiles, as it was traditionally held that the Contra Gentiles was written for the Spanish Dominicans preaching to Muslims, that may not be the case historically, but Torel holds that there is still a preaching context, an apologetical context to the Contra Gentiles. And so I argued with regard to the argument for motion that Thomas isn't happy with it, that I did a bit of a comparative analysis that, he takes several thousand words just to deal with the argument for motion, whereas in the Summa Theologiae, with regard to the 5 ways, he takes just a few hundred words to deal with all of the 5 ways. And so I kind of argue, and Thomas is not happy with this argument. He's trying to fix it because the audience that he's presenting it to just are not metaphysicians. They might hold Aristotle in high regard, but they're just not, sort of metaphysicians that Thomas has in mind. And so he has to get them up to that level. And I think the same thing, I think that the Contra Gentiles is just like that throughout. It's a lovely wee work by Aquinas, but you just do not get to see the metaphysician come out as clearly as you do in the Disputed Questions or the Summa Theologiae or the Sentences commentary. Now, the supplement to the Summa is brought together by the Sentences commentary, a youthful commentary. Yes, this is youthful, but look, so is the De Ente et Essentia, a youthful treatise. So I think in the Sentences commentary, you get to see Thomas, full metaphysician Jedi Master come out in that, whereas in the Contra Gentiles, he's being a wee bit more strategic in the way he puts things across, and he doesn't let the full metaphysics come out. It's almost as if, let's say you're a university academic and you're put into, a high school to talk the existence of God with the students. You kind of have to hold back a wee bit. And I feel that Thomas is doing that in the Contra Gentiles. So you get those same discussions from the supplement in the Contra Gentiles, but I just think there's more of the metaphysician Thomas in the supplement because it is drawn from the Sentences commentary. And so to me, it's a bit more valuable than where you get the discussions elsewhere. So yeah, I do think it's worth studying. And look, everything by Thomas, I think, is worth studying. He's one of those philosophers like Kant, Hegel, Plato, Aristotle that he's just worth going over again and again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's great, Gavin. All right, this one from Brendan. This is great content, and I appreciate it. Are you familiar with Graham Oppy's critique of the first way? If so, what do you think he is missing?
Yeah. So I wrote an article on existential inertia and Aquinas' way to God, and I wrote an article on Aquinas' first way, the argument from motion, and reconsidering the Aquinas' first way, because Oppy, as I've read Oppy is not attacking Aquinas' first way. In his recent critique, he's attacking Fieser's argument from motion. So he doesn't have the first way in mind. He has Fieser in mind there, which is one thing to bear in mind. But I dealt with the first way in the article in the first way. Again, it's coming out in the Collected Articles book. And I engaged with both Oppy and Joseph Schmidt, who's followed up with Oppy on this issue of existential inertia. And I basically point out, and it's a common theme in my defense of Aquinas' arguments for God, that we do not enter these arguments with a mindset of metaphysical neutrality. So we're not neutral with regard to our metaphysical commitments. We enter these arguments engaging with the metaphysics, that Thomas uses to buttress the arguments. The metaphysics is the buttress, it's the scaffold on which the arguments stand. Now, if Oppy has a problem, or if anybody has a problem with Aquinas' arguments for God, it's very unlikely to be the arguments themselves. It's likely to be the metaphysical buttressing of the premises of the arguments. And that's what Oppy attacks when he attacks the argument from motion which Fieser presents. Because a principle behind Thomas's thinking is that things which are paralleled possess their actuality because they participate in some per se source for that actuality. That means at any point in which they have actuality, that actuality is being caused in them because they participate in that actuality. So at any point we enjoy illumination, it's because illumination is being caused in us, say by the sun. Oppy's critique is that, well, look, that's not how existence works. The way existence works is that things have existence and they just go on having existence unless some cause comes along to stop them having existence. In other words, we don't invoke a cause for a thing having existence at any point that it has. It's not a participated source of existence. Rather, we evoke a cause whenever a thing ceases to have existence. So something's granted existence, it possesses existence, and then it only ceases to exist when something knocks it out of existence. Now, the problem with that as an attack on Aquinas is that it fundamentally diverges from the metaphysical buttressing of Aquinas' first way. The metaphysical buttressing of Aquinas' first way is that potency is actualized. Actuality is not potentialized. Actuality doesn't subsist in the potency. The potency is actualized by the source of actuality. So it's not the case that the actuality comes down and sits in the potency and just stays there until knocked out of the potency. It's that the potency is drawn into actuality by the source of actuality. So this idea of existential inertia just doesn't make sense on Aquinas' metaphysics. Now, Oppy is free to reject that metaphysics, but then he has to do the hard work of being a metaphysician and engaging with that. And Oppy just doesn't do that. And that's not Oppy's modus operandi in philosophy, because he doesn't think that metaphysical reasoning and argumentation is the way to go in philosophy. Because for him, philosophical engagement is one of comparing two positions and asking whose grass is greener, whose does more with less. It's just worldview comparison. It's not the traditional task of philosophy of forming arguments, making deductions, inferences, and coming to conclusions. It's really just comparing two things and asking which is better. Well, that is not at all what Thomas is doing. Thomas is putting forth the metaphysics, making deductions, inferences, and seeing where they go. Given Oppy's MO in philosophy, he is unable to evaluate Aquinas' metaphysics because he just doesn't do that sort of metaphysical reasoning. Now, Oppy asks us to consider, as an example of existential inertia, he says, take some color property. When we color a chair red, the chair doesn't remain red because it's continually dependent on a source of redness, say the one who dyes it. It remains red until somebody comes along and dyes it green. Well. Anybody who has read Aquinas' Principles of Nature or philosophy of nature in general will tell you that the chair does remain red because it does depend on a continual source of redness, not the efficient cause of red, but on the formal cause of red, i.e. that the chair is constituted in such a way that it looks red. That's the formal cause of the redness, the chair being formed in that way that it be red. The chair depends on that formal cause, not the efficient cause which introduces the form, but certainly the formal cause. Not only that, existence is not like a color property. The reason why the color property remains or subsists or persists in the chair is because the chair subsists. The reason why existence remains in the thing is not because the thing persists, because the thing persists only because it has existence. So the persistence of existence is not because the thing will exist, but because there's some source of existence which grants existence to the thing and allows the thing to persist at any point at which it does persist. Okay, so existence plays a different causal role in the constitution of things than does color properties. And all of that is to say, when we go back to the first way, for Thomas, it's not actuality which is potentialized, brought down into the potency and just subsists there in the potency like the color property in the chair. It's potency which is actualized, like something being illuminated by the light of the sun and depending on the light of the sun for its illumination for at any point that it's illuminated. So Oppie's objection, if it's an objection to Aquinas' first way, which it isn't, it's an objection to Feser, but if it should be construed as an objection to Aquinas' first way, misses the mark entirely.
Yeah, great response, Gavin. And not only that, but I will also say that Feser himself has defended against Oppie's objections in print. He's got an article with Religious Studies. Forget the title of it, but it was quite good. So people, if making the distinction that you made, that there is a difference between Aquinas' first way, certainly as you defended it, and Feser's Aristotelian proof, take into consideration what Gavin said for Aquinas' first way. But Feser has his own response, which I thought was very well done as well. If people want to just check that out in addition to that. Do you have time for one more question, Gavin?
Absolutely, yeah.
Let's do it. This is great. This was fun. If there's one that's grabbing your eye, Gavin, go ahead and snag it up there.
I'm happy to be surprised.
All right, let me. Let's see here. Let's take this one from Meow Meow Meow. Gentle listener, thank you as always for your support here, Meow. Dr. Kerr, does it make sense to say that willing the good for others is a transcendental perfection, so that God maximally wills the good for his rational creatures? What do you make of this question, Gavin?
Okay, willing the good for others, is that a transcendental perfection? So just taking that part of the question, no, willing the good for others can't be a transcendental perfection, because a transcendental perfection is something which is convertible with being and reveals something about being not originally contained in the notion, in the term being itself. So unity, truth, and goodness say something about being. They coincide with being and they're referentially identical to being. But they signify something other than the term being signifies. So that's just the first part of the question. The second,
here's a clarification, Gavin. If we want to just read this real quick, clarifying my question: goodness and being are convertible. God is maximal being, hence maximal goodness, and goodness seems to include willing the good for others. So God's nature is to will the good? Question mark. Maybe.
Yeah, so God's nature is to will the good. Yeah, God cannot but will the good. So when we analyze God's will, given that God's essence is pure goodness itself and his will is identical to its essence, God cannot but will the good. But this doesn't mean that he wills the good for others, because God's willing of the good is simply his love for the good that he is. Okay, so you can will the good, and that can mean providing the good for another. So my wife wills the good for me. She gives me like my 8th coffee of the day, or she comes back home.
Is that willing the good for somebody?
Yes, it is. So
be willing the death of Pat Flynn.
there's that kind of willing the good of providing the good for another, but there's also willing the good of the other simply by loving them and and appreciating them for the value that they are. So I can will the good for my wife by, driving her here, there, and everywhere, giving her things, supporting her, all of that. But I can also will will the good for her as a value by simply appreciating her and loving her as the center of value that she is. And so when we say that God wills the good, essentially, that's what we mean, that God simply loves himself as the good, as that valuable center of goodness that he is. So any willing of the good for others is excessive. It's gratuitous. It's not necessary. God doesn't have to do it. It's utterly arbitrary. So back to the actual question, because the question, could you bring up the clarification there again?
I sure can.
Yeah. So goodness seems to include willing the good for other selves. So God's nature is to will the good. Yes. So God's nature is to will the good, which is to love the good that he himself is. That does not require willing the good for other selves. So God, being maximal in being and maximal in goodness, he can will the good necessarily that he himself is, just simply by loving himself. That doesn't have to spill over into willing it for others.
Groovy, my friend. All right, this has been a fantastic episode, Gavin, as I knew it would be. The fourth way has been requested for a while, and hopefully people, it really has been. I know at least Callum has asked for it, and others I've gotten a number of emails for the fourth way. So here you go. But obviously with a podcast, you can't cover absolutely everything. So we have to encourage people to go and read your written work on it. So Gavin, remind us one more time of this upcoming book of yours, your collection of articles.
Yeah.
Where can people get it? Is it available for pre-order? Please make sure that you tell them so they can go get it right now. Yeah.
So it's being published by Editionis Scholasticae. Anybody familiar with Ed Feser's work? He published Scholastic Metaphysics with these publishers.
And Aristotle's Revenge with them too. Yeah, those two are really good. I really like their stuff they're putting out. Mm-hmm.
So this is the collected articles in the existence of God. So this volume has all of my 5 ways articles. It's got my De Ente et Essentia article, which is the article which prompted me to write the book on the De Ente et Essentia. Published that when I was still a student. It's got my article in the Contra Gentiles argument. It's got my articles in Existential Inertia, per se ordered series. Some new articles on how we can actually demonstrate God's existence, how we go from God's existence to God's nature. But that's coming out with Editionis Scholasticae. I've been told 4 weeks before it's available in the UK. I imagine something similar with the US. It's available from the publisher's website, Editionis Scholasticae, available on Amazon as well and all usual book outlets. Anywhere you got Feser's Aristotle's Revenge, you'll be able to get this.
Yeah, speaking of, I had this just lying around. This one's Feser's, of course, but they do a really nice job with these books. Really, really good stuff. Yeah. So excited for yours, Gavin. I will be sure after the stream to link it in the comments. Mm-hmm. And guys, please support Gavin, support his good work. If you like what he's doing on a podcast, I tell you, the written stuff, a lot of what I hope to do with this podcast, because it's a podcast, you can't do everything in a podcast. I hope at least to entice people to the deeper material elsewhere. It's really good. It really is. And the cool thing is, like, a lot of these books, they can be super pricey, the academic books, but it's, it sounds like this one isn't going to be, for collection of articles, $20 to $30. That's a steal as far as I'm concerned. So pick it up, guys, and I'll link it below, the pre-order or when it's out below. So anything else you're working on or want to mention before we say goodbye, Gavin? Mm-hmm.
Let me see. So I'm writing an article on Aquinas' principle that being is what the intellect first conceives, and I'm linking that up with Kant in Critique of Pure Reason.
Oh, so I'm excited about that one. That's cool. Yeah.
Writing that. I'm giving a paper on survivalism in New Orleans in about a month's time to the ACPA. So if any of the gentle listeners are in New Orleans for the ACPA at the time, come along and say hello, have a fight with me. I'm in fight training, so I need sparring partners. So we'll do that. That'll be fun. But that paper on survivalism, then that's gonna be made into, written up into a full paper, published in the Proceedings. So working on that at the minute as well. And I'm pretty sure I have a few other deadlines that I've got at the minute, which being an academic, deadlines are sort of floating about everywhere. So there's a few other papers for various volumes that have been invited to write for. I'm doing that, and also the business of teaching and supervising PhD students and all the rest. I can't forget my day job.
Yeah, well, we
that's what
really appreciate you taking the time to be here, Gavin. It's been super awesome, super useful. So, guys, aside from getting the book, please like this episode. Please share it on the social medias. Leave your comments. Let us know what you think about this, and I would love to hear in the comments what you would like to hear Gavin discuss next time he is on as well. So, after the stream, I have to insist, because if you do it on the stream here, it'll disappear. So in the comments after the stream, give let me know your recommendations, what you'd like to see Gavin on for next time. We'll see if we can make that happen. Gavin, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks for having me on. Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye, everyone. And hey, I'll be right back, but I totally forgot. I'll be back in 10 minutes with Eric Ibarra on the Filioque. So don't go far. Switching streams.